They said no one could escape it. In the year 1348, the Black Death swept across Europe like a storm sent by God himself. Cities choked with corpses, bells tolled without end, and priests blessed entire streets before dying themselves. People hid indoors, locked their doors, and waited for death to knock. But the chronicles tell of something strange. Far from the cities in forgotten valleys, small hamlets, and mountain villages, some communities survived almost untouched. While entire kingdoms mourned, these peasants lived on. No doctors, no science, no divine miracle. Just a handful of old customs that everyone else mocked. How did the poorest, least educated people in Europe manage to do what even kings and priests could not outsmart the plague? When the plague hit London, Florence, and Paris, doctors bled their patients and burned incense in their homes. They believed the air itself carried death, miasma, they called it. In cities, streets overflowed with filth, rats, and human waste. But in the countryside, life moved differently. In many villages, peasants burned herbs not for medicine, but for ritual juniper, sage, and rosemary. They believed smoke frightened evil spirits from the house. Ironically, it did something else. It drove away fleas. Records from a remote valley in the Alps describe peasants throwing damp straw and pine branches into their fireplaces, filling homes with thick, acrid smoke. The smell was awful. The fleas hated it. Their superstition saved them. Even the way peasants lived, spaced apart in small cottages, rarely visiting neighbors, acted like a primitive form of quarantine. They called it keeping the sickness out. Modern scientists call it social distancing. In the royal courts, people fled together in panic. Nobles, servants, priests, all packed into country estates. They carried the plague with them. But peasants who saw the first blackened bodies acted differently. When someone fell ill, the villagers sealed the cottage, leaving food at the door, never crossing the threshold again. To outsiders, it looked cruel. To them, it was duty. A surviving letter from a priest in Bohemia describes a mountain hamlet that closed its paths to strangers and prayed from afar. That village never fell sick. The priest called it a miracle of faith. But looking back, it was simply observation. They noticed how the sickness spread. In England, one village Eyam famously isolated itself centuries later during another plague. Yet similar practices existed long before. Monks recorded that some peasants nailed red crosses to their doors and refused to let even priests inside. They were shamed for it. Still, they lived. Sometimes survival looks like sin. Peasant remedies seemed foolish to educated men. They chewed garlic, drank vinegar, and boiled nettles in goat's milk. But these same habits kept their water cleaner and killed bacteria, though they had no word for it. In some Slavic villages, families scrubbed floors with ash and lye. In others, they hung wet cloths soaked in vinegar at the windows. Meanwhile, in Paris, scholars debated how the planets caused pestilence. They never noticed the rats running between their feet. In one convent's chronicle from northern Italy, the sisters wrote about a peasant cure, burning one's clothes after a funeral. The nuns dismissed it as wasteful madness. But modern science later proved that the Yersinia pestis bacterium clung to fabric and fur. By destroying the garments, those peasants destroyed the infection chain. What the educated world called ignorance was, in truth, instinct, honed by survival. In the French countryside, families lived with animals under one roof: goats, pigs, chickens. To outsiders, it was a sign of filth. Yet in many such homes, rats avoided nesting, chased off by the noise and smell of larger livestock. A few surviving tax records even show entire hamlets that lost no one to the plague at all. Officials refused to believe it. They accused survivors of witchcraft, and when the church sent investigators, they found nothing. No rituals, no spells, only burned bedding and smoky air. The irony is painful. Those who survived were scorned as superstitious, even sinful. Those who followed proper medicine, bloodletting, prayers in crowded churches died by the thousands. In truth, the peasants didn't outthink death. They simply paid attention. They watched who lived, who died, and changed their ways before the scholars finished their first theories. But survival had a cost. Many of those villages sealed themselves off completely. No trade, no weddings, no church services. For months they lived like ghosts. Fields went untilled, bells silent. Their reward was life and unbearable loneliness. One account from a German monastery describes a group of peasants who survived the plague winter only to starve the next year. The monks wrote, "They feared people more than death itself." Still, when spring came and travelers passed through, they were astonished. A living village among ruins. The peasants told no tales of divine mercy, only that they had burned what must burn, avoided who must be avoided, and kept breathing when others stopped. Centuries later, scientists would call these behaviors accidental public health. The peasants would have called them common sense. Archaeologists have since uncovered traces of those lucky communities. In some places, few graves mark the plague, years only charred soil, and layers of ash from burned dwellings. Microscopic samples show no human remains inside, meaning the people fled or survived. In an alpine valley in modern Switzerland, one mass of clay ovens bears signs of deliberate fire damage, suggesting villagers torched their own homes to drive out pests. Nearby, pollen samples show fields replanted within a year. Life returned quickly where death had passed them by. It wasn't luck, it was behavior. Human instinct, raw, desperate, uneducated, turned into survival strategy. When later physicians studied these regions, they realized that isolation, burning of materials, and even herbal smoke all lowered plague mortality. In a world without microscopes, the peasants had somehow read nature better than the scholars. Today, when we talk about the Black Death, we imagine despair masks, carts of corpses, a civilization collapsing. But hidden beneath that horror are stories of quiet resilience. No monuments were built for the peasants who saved themselves. Their names vanished, their fields reclaimed by forest. Yet their instincts became the foundation for hygiene, quarantine, and rural medicine. The next time someone calls medieval peasants ignorant, remember, when the world burned, they didn't pray for miracles, they made their own. Maybe they didn't outsmart the Black Death with knowledge, but they outlived it with wisdom older than any book.